The motivation for writing this paper is, there are two motivations actually. One is more general and relates to the methodology, and another one is more practical. The time when we designed this, the goal was to assess the impact of an intervention on empowerment. By the way, the idea came from Howard White. Okay, so that's and so he inspired this research, and certainly this it shows how it was well ahead of his time, because this was about 10 years ago, and from the idea, from him having the idea to me putting it in practice took about 10 years. So certainly it was a great achievement. So the specific goal, as I said, was evaluating the impact of an intervention on empowerment. A lot of projects measuring, a lot of projects having the goal of achieving empowerment, but there's very few really able to assess the impact of the intervention on women's empowerment. And then there was another motivation for writing this paper, which is more methodological, which is about what is the best way of doing this. One question you may have is to say, well, why do we want to do this? There is a lot of way that people have used to measure empowerment. Do we need another indicator, or empowerment indicator? So no, I'm not proposing another empowerment index here, but I'm trying to show what can be done with an alternative method for measuring empowerment, which is precisely using the vignettes. And the reason is because the idea that we had at the time, but still valid today, is that the methods used to measure empowerment, particularly empowerment indices, are costly and quite expensive, and also they are biased somehow by subjective perception. So I'm going to explain now what I mean by this, doing some examples. Empowerment, as you know, is multidimensional. There is a paper by Solava and Alkai from 2007. They found 29 different definitions of empowerment. And that was about 7 years ago. There's probably more now. Now, all these definitions must be probably correct. It's just that empowerment can be seen from different perspectives, different point of view, and has very many aspects and dimensions. Therefore, all methods that have tried to measure empowerment have tried to cover all these many dimensions. And these have resulted in building indices of empowerment. And in order to cover all these dimensions, require very long questionnaires. So a couple of examples here. This is the World Bank Empowerment Index. I don't think it's a World Bank official empowerment index, but developed by the World Bank. And it covers 8 domains: justice, politics, all domains where you can analyze empowerment, public services, labor, goods, decision-making within the housing community. Well, I counted the question at the end of the book, and I found 164. So it was 164 questions needed to measure empowerment. There's a more recent index, which is the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index, and which is a joint effort of Oxford University and IFPRI. Now we have fewer domains, which is 6, but still we have 60 questions. So, you know, very long questionnaires. And the reason is because they try to cover all aspects of empowerment. So that makes for very long and expensive questionnaires. Another problem with these indices is that they are, to some extent, relying on subjective perceptions. And just to make a couple of examples, these are 2 questions that I took from the World Bank Index, Empowerment Index. And the question is, how much influence do you think you have when the community selects its leaders? And there is another one here from the Empowerment in Agriculture Index. To what extent do you feel you can make your own personal decisions regarding these aspects of household life if you wanted to? These are not a question measuring anything objective, but they are measuring how people perceive they having influence or their feelings. Now, the problem when this happens is that perception can be biased, so people don't necessarily report their objective living standard, but what they perceive, which does not necessarily correspond to reality. This is true for empowerment, but it's true for many other contexts. And you will see actually the methodology of vignettes originated in studies of disability, for example, and where there's a famous studies conducted by the WHO on disability show that there is higher disability in Western countries, rich countries, than in poorer ones, when we actually know that is objectively not true. But it's because it's based on reporting. So, and the reason is that people, in the case of disability in poor countries, when they report their disability, they use a different scale, different standards from what we do in Western countries. So, for example, in what is a minor physical impairment in rural India would be reported as a strong disability in the United States. So people are using different scales, and the result of that is that indices or measurement that are based on subjective perceptions are not comparable to each other. So they cannot be compared across people, they cannot be compared across groups or across countries. That's in the case of disability. So two problems, the cost and the perception bias, led us to think that we should use a different index, a different method to measure empowerment. And that's why we decided to use the method of the vignettes. Now, before telling you about the methods, I want to first set the context of in which we analyze empowerment using vignettes, which is a project in rural Andhra Pradesh in India, the Andhra Pradesh Rural Livelihood Project. This project is part of a family of projects that were implemented in those years, and it's still very popular today. And the goal is this project is to promote watershed development, poverty reduction by empowering women. And the center of the whole intervention is the self-help group, or SHG, which is basically consists of forming groups of women. They're meeting regularly. And in this case, in the case of this specific project, they would do two things. One is to make decisions about how the project's fund would be spent in the community, and on providing loans to his members, to the group members. So the goal is, so how do we assess this? And we say, okay, with the index biased by perception, building a long questionnaire would be too expensive, so we decided to use the vignettes. So I'll show you now what the vignette is. And this is an example of the vignettes that we used in Andhra Pradesh. And you'll see that the whole, it's basically just one question, really. So the question is, how much, very direct, how much freedom opportunity do you have? And of course, that's not exactly the question, so it was translated in Telugu with some appropriate, with a term having an appropriate meaning in the context. And we interviewed 1,500 women, and just asking the question directly. Now, of course, this question is very similar to the question that I showed earlier from the empowerment indices. And there is a high risk of perception bias here, because so respondents are asked to report their level of empowerment on a scale from no empowerment at all, some empowerment, and quite a lot of empowerment, and a lot of empowerment. So in a scale from 1 to 4, reporting empowerment, and there is a perception bias. So that's why we use next the vignettes, which is these three other question, if you like. Vignettes consist basically of telling the respondent stories about three characters. In this case, there is Nilama, Manem, and Chandama, three different women with three different experiences with self-help groups and loans. The first one took a loan from the SAG, from the self-help group, and started a successful business. The second one took the loan but had to give the money to the husband. And the third one is the clearly disempowered woman. She was not able, she took the loan, no, she was not even able to take the loan because husband and mother-in-law were opposed. So you see, these three characters depict some women who are objectively And we can see it is clear which one is empowered and which is not. Okay, so in a way that there will be, so to say, it's a general consensus about whether these women are empowered in different ways. So how the method works. At this point, the respondent, after answering question 1, will also rate the level of empowerment of these 3 women. And why do we want to do this? Because if you look at the first question, how much freedom do you have? And suppose I answer, I have a lot of freedom. Okay? Now, the problem is, what do you mean by that? Now, if the person is also saying that Chandama, that has no power at all, if the woman says she has a lot of freedom, now I understand what she means by having a lot of freedom. So the goal of the vignette is to understand what are the standards that people use to make self-reporting. We did the same with the male respondent. There was no real, any specific goals for doing this because the project was not designed to empowering men. But we did it nevertheless as an experiment for testing the methodology. So it's quite similar. So the question is, how much influence do you have in your village, and then the vignettes, in order to try to with different characters about the land dispute. As I said, what is the goal of this? The goal is removing perception from self-reporting and having a measure of empowerment which is, as possible, objective. But there is also another goal which is interesting, because by doing this exercise, we also find out to what extent people are overstating or understating their for example, empowerment status. And that might have some interest to find out what categories of people are having or reporting a different perception from what actually reality is. So it's a kind of twofold goal. As I said, this method is very simple in terms of administering the survey in the field. So just one question. And it's actually even simpler than that, because while the first question is, everybody is answering the first question, the vignettes are only administered to a subsample of the entire group of women. So we actually use the information from a subsample to correct perception bias for the entire group. And that brings me to telling you about what is the only difficulty in using this method, which is employing a statistical model which is a bit sophisticated. It was developed by Gary King and others. It's called the Hoppit model, which is a modification of the order appropriate model. And is actually modeling precisely what I said, trying to split the self-reporting in first understanding people reporting, and then secondly correcting for the reporting. So it's kind of two-step procedure. Well, I'm not going to go into the detail of how this works. I'm going to show some results of this. Now this is a chart showing simple correlations between women's empowerment and literacy. It's actually looking at literacy, husband's literacy, not women's literacy. And the bars show the reported levels of empowerment. The blue one is no power, and moving to the right, empowerment goes up. So the yellow bar represents a lot of power as self-reported. And you can see that when it comes to self-reporting, women from literate families, or whose husband is illiterate, tend to report higher level of empowerment. And I have lots of these slides that are showing these simple correlations. So the same is for men. So many more men are reporting lack of power when they are illiterate. So that's the chart on the right-hand side. So it's kind of what you expect. So there is a correlation between reporting of empowerment and some characteristics. And I have many of these bar charts, but I'm not going to show you all this. But yes, there is a correlation between wage work and empowerment, of course the social status like caste membership. So it's more clear about men. You see that, of course, male respondent of scheduled caste and tribes are reporting much higher level of disempowerment, the blue bar, than respondent of higher caste. Now, all this is correlations, but it's also biased by perception. So remember what we're trying to do is to remove perceptions from self-reporting. And that's what we do with statistical models. So I have to show some numbers here. It's probably too far for me to see. The statistical model shown here, basically we're comparing results from an order probit for those of you who have familiarity with econometrics. So this we have on one side a model which is looking at the impact of characteristics on the probability of being empowered, if you like. And what it's showing, so these are the numbers on the left-hand side. And you see there are a number of stars, meaning statistical significance. So this is good. And they show that empowerment, self-reported empowerment, is correlated in the way that you expect. So pretty much in the same way that I was showing in the chart. So with the husband's education, whether women are female-headed households, or whether they are engaged in agricultural labor, and so on. And of course, being member of self-help groups. So women members of self-help groups are reporting higher levels of empowerment. However, once we I have to stop.
Yeah. Can you wind up?
Okay, I'll be quick. Okay. Well, 3 minutes left, I think. Okay. Okay, so the numbers on the right-hand side are the numbers of the model adjusted by perceptions in the way that I described. And the result that you see is that none of the variables that we found to have an impact on empowerment are no longer significant. And even the variables representing self-help group is still statistical significance holds, but it has a smaller effect size. So what it is telling us is telling us that the difference that we observe in self-reporting across these categories are basically the result of perceptions, are not real, with the exception of self-help groups. Now, we adjusted self-help groups by the impacts the self-help groups estimate by using the statistical model, but this is still just a correlation. And we actually, so it's not exogenous. We designed the study as a project and control group designed with difference in difference, and so having like all the studies that were reported by Naila in the previous study were all, this is not a randomized trial, but having a solid control group. However, after doing the baseline, we found out that the government of Andhra Pradesh has decided to scale up the intervention and the self-help groups to the entire state, and for the implementation of a World Bank project. So while at the beginning we thought that project group the control group would not have self-help groups, we ended up with self-help groups in all villages. Okay, so what we found is basically, in the previous numbers, is just a correlation between self-help groups and empowerment, but it doesn't say anything whether it's self-help group empowering women or is empowered women that are joining self-help groups. Okay, so what we did next is trying to use some, what's next available good econometric techniques to test this. And so we used some instrumental variable approach and difference in difference analysis. We're using the variables that we could. And what we found is that the impact of SHGs vanishes. So it's no longer statistical significant, suggesting that that correlation actually goes the other way around. It's potentially it's women, empower women that are joining self-help groups and not self-help groups that are empowering women. I also had some results for male respondent, but I guess I have to skip that one and then jump to the conclusions.
And please ask Professor.
And the conclusions are, there you can ask the questions. And the conclusions are that in the specific, well, that's what just said. What we found is that with all the weaknesses, of course, this evaluation design that survey groups were not a very powerful tool for empowering women in this particular case in Andhra Pradesh. However, I think the interest of this study was more in the testing the methodology rather than in specific finding out the results of this. I think this is a valuable tool. There is, of course, a complexity in using the tools when you have to employ the statistical model. So but in terms of conducting the survey and running the study in the field is, I believe, is quite effective method to try to observe some of the impossible to observe phenomena like empowerment. And it could also be applied to many other aspects of life, living standards, or well-being.
Thank you.
That concludes. Thank you.